Welcome back, everyone. Um, this lecture is devoted to a discussion of Michel de Montaigne, the great French humanist Renaissance philosopher of the 16th century. Before we get into Montaigne, though, I wanted to comment on the narrative of the course itself. It may not always be apparent to students, but there is a kind of narrative construct that lays at the foundation of this course. Historical narrative that goes along with kind of a conceptual framework that we're trying to establish in this course. So we began our narrative by reading a brief excerpt from Livy's History of Rome and the letter of Columbus to Ferdinand and Isabella, talking about his discovery, and we've introduced a couple of concepts already. One of those is the concept of place. Kind of the power of place, the connections that people make between place and identity, and that's something that will carry through the course as we bring up other topics. So they'll all be connected in some way to that concept. But also, we've introduced the understanding of self. As we consider the connection between place and identity, we also need to think about how we conceive of ourselves, personal identity, and that can be bound up with place. It can be bound up with, of course, the background from which we come, whether that's family or nation or whatever it is. And these can lead, these ideas, these conceptions can lead to a sense of kind of personal superiority. This is where the notion of ethnocentrism enters into the course. And the reason that we turn now to Montaigne is that he was one of the kind of landmark thinkers on the topic of self-awareness. And a lot of this was bound up with Renaissance humanism, of which he was a participant, a school of thought, I should say, in which he was a participant. But he was an intensely self-aware thinker. And one of the goals of this course is to instill in the students a sense of self-awareness, self-critique. And so someone like Montaigne to understand how he does this, and that may serve as a model for our own self-reflection and self-critique that we carry out. So feel free to bring these topics up in the discussion board. The discussion this week will at least touch on this notion of self-awareness. The background for Montaigne. We need to think first about the school of thought known as humanism. As the name indicates, the focus of humanism is the human being. And that could refer to either the capabilities of the human being or just the figure of a human being. And although there are thinkers in the ancient world who might be accurately labeled humanists, I think that Plato and Aristotle both have tokens of humanism in their thought, at least. Socrates was certainly a very self-aware, self-critical kind of thinker, and Plato and Aristotle to some extent followed in his footsteps. But for the immediate background of Montaigne, we need to start with the medieval system of thought known as scholasticism. Now, this lecture will not contain a thorough exploration of scholasticism. That is a topic I'm well versed in as a historian of the Middle Ages, but suffice it to say that in the 12th and 13th centuries in particular, thinkers in the cathedral schools and the budding universities of Europe arrived at a system of thought that stressed reason above all other things. The Latin word for reason is ratio, or ratio, depending on how you pronounce that. And it was thought that all things could be understood through means of reason. God, the universe, everything could be comprehended. In fact, God, according to the scholastic philosophers, God set it up that way. He meant for human beings to explore using their own capabilities of reasoning. Now, this focus was largely on man as a microcosm in a much broader narrative of salvation, man as he relates to God and all of creation. There wasn't, in the Middle Ages, necessarily a focus on single human beings and their capabilities. Although there are very self-aware thinkers in the Middle Ages, that's not the emphasis of this school of thought. That sort of line of thinking arrives with what is commonly called the Renaissance. Now, that term itself has been problematized, but let's use it here. We're talking about this whole system of cultural change that arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe, initially in Italy, the major cities of Italy like Florence and Genoa and Pisa and Venice, particularly Florence and Genoa, were important in this regard. And from Italy spread to other parts of Europe, with kind of a major flowering in the Low Countries, what's now Belgium and Holland, particularly an artistic flowering there, and a flowering in France. And Montaigne was perhaps the chief representative of the French Renaissance. But Renaissance humanism emphasized, found great traction in thinking about mankind, or individual man, and his or her capabilities. Perhaps the foremost text of Renaissance humanism was written by one of the precursors to Montaigne's thinking, Pico della Mirandola, the 16th century, early 16th century Italian thinker. And just the title of Pico's work is demonstrative of the kind of approach that Renaissance humanism took. His work is called On the Origins and Dignity of Mankind, or On the Origins and Dignity of Man. I forget which it is, man or mankind. In any case, the origins and dignity. The word dignity is curious there. That mankind was thought by these humanist scholars to have a certain dignity, that he was the pinnacle of God's creation. This still is taking place very much in a Christian framework. The Renaissance humanists did not reject Christianity, but they were less interested in man as a microcosm of some larger grand narrative of salvation, and more interested in the individual quest of mankind. And with that came a self-awareness and a self-critique that simply hadn't existed much before that. And we can see this in artwork as well. If you look at the two famous works of art that are displayed on this slide, we have in the upper right-hand corner Michelangelo's sculpture of David, of which there is a very nice replica in St. Augustine, outside of the Ripley's Museum. But the David statue is a spectacular example of Renaissance thinking, the focus on mankind. If you notice, the anatomy is the attention to detail with the musculature, with the layout of the body is, there's an exactness to this, a kind of virtuosity of technique that is remarkable. David is a man, and it's, again, the attention to detail, the celebration of not only the physical frame of man, but also the kind of the potential of mankind is on display here, and we can see that as well in the. So that's from Italy. We have a Northern Renaissance example here as well. The Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, and the famous Arnolfini portrait. And this is a portrait commissioned by someone who, I think it's a merchant, who had the money simply to commission a work that depicted him and his wife. And I mean, the perspective here is really remarkable. If you look closely at the painting, you'll see there's a mirror on the back wall, and the painter is on display in the mirror. And so this isn't an idealized sort of depiction of a man and a woman. It's a very real one. She is pregnant. They didn't omit that. And the focus is on getting the people correct here and displaying them in their everyday life, with all of their imperfections and their potential at the same time. So very much a focus on individual man. So that Renaissance humanism is really the key intellectual, conceptual framework in which Montaigne was writing his essays. Now, other important precursors who were really part of the Northern Renaissance, Erasmus of Rotterdam, the famous Northern Renaissance literary figure, was really quite remarkable. He was a satirist, sort of in the old Roman style, but was critical of not only, of the society of his time, of the religion of his time, all with a view that man can be better than they are right now, that they can, it's critical in a kind of satirical sense. Erasmus is often uproariously funny in his writings, but very much concerned with the capabilities of mankind. And we find similar thoughts in one of the interlocutors of Erasmus, the English philosopher Thomas More. More was also critical. He's probably most famous for writing his work Utopia, which actually was written very early in his career, also for standing up to Henry VIII as his chancellor, and as a committed Catholic, standing up to him and opposing him, or at least remaining silent on the question of Henry's desired divorce from his wife Catherine. It's a great movie called A Man for All Seasons about Thomas More, made in the 1960s, that I would recommend to everyone. But in Utopia, for instance, Thomas More again talks about the capabilities of mankind, about the potential that they have to create what is a perfect society. And this sort of work could probably only have been written in the age of the voyages of exploration. So here's another connection to Columbus. In Utopia, Thomas More reports that he met up with a fellow named Raphael Hythloday, who had traveled out into the ocean somewhere, into the South Pacific. And this is in the age of the voyages of Magellan and others who were circumnavigating the globe. But Hythloday had traveled into the South Pacific and had come upon an island community there called Utopia. And these people had formed the perfect society, a society that had no flaws, no conflict. It was an enclosed society. It was one that was cut off from the rest of the world, but had done remarkable things. And really, More was trying to bring to full fruition the thinking of Plato, especially in Plato's work, The Republic, in this regard. And these places that were newly discovered by Europeans with supposedly primitive or savage peoples offered the potential to start afresh, as it were, to go to a people who had not been corrupted by modern life, and potentially to create the perfect society. Now, we can see in Montaigne's essay on cannibals that he proposes very much the same thing. He says, I wish that Plato or Lycurgus or one of these other kind of utopian figures could have gotten hold of these people, because they would have done remarkable things with them. And so the thought here with More and with Montaigne is that mankind can potentially perfect society. It should be noted that Montaigne lived during the Reformation, really kind of the height of the Reformation, when France and other places in Europe were riven with religious wars. There was a great deal of conflict, and in fact Montaigne, toward the end of his life, ended up being inserted into one of these conflicts. as King Henry III of France died, and the heir to the throne was Henry of Navarre, who was a Protestant, and Montaigne, although he was Catholic, ended up supporting Henry de Navarre, Henri de Navarre, in his desire to become king. In fact, he did become King Henry IV, and thus showered some favors upon Montaigne for the support that he had given him. Montaigne's own family was riven with this religious conflict to some extent. He remained Catholic, but several of his siblings turned to Protestantism at various times in their lives. And so Montaigne really tried to rise above the fray of these religious conflicts, but it was a very important part of the background. Now, Montaigne had a very interesting, one might say a charmed life. His father was a merchant, in fact a fish merchant, specialized in herring, but had achieved a fabulous fortune. In fact, so great that he was able to buy a title, to purchase a chateau or a castle. You can see the 16th century, the last remaining 16th century vestige of that castle down at the bottom there. This is the famous tower that Montaigne spent much of his later life in writing the essays. It's the only part of that castle that actually dates from that period. The castle itself is a tourist destination, and there were later additions to it that are really quite spectacular. But his father wanted Michel to have a first-class education, but not only in kind of the liberal arts, but also in practical things. And so for the first 3 years of his life, Monsieur de Montaigne sent his son to live with a peasant family so that he did with the people who needed their help, he said. After that, he hired a German tutor and a set of servants who were instructed to speak to young Michel in Latin, and only in Latin. In fact, the whole family only spoke to him in the Latin language, so that Latin, the language of education, the language of learning, the language of the liberal arts, would be his first language. And in fact, Michel did not learn French until later in childhood, until he was 6 or 7. That was only at that point that he began to learn French. He was taught very well by this German tutor in the liberal arts. He is the embodiment in many ways of the liberalis that we talked about in one of the previous lectures, the free man, the nobleman who receives this education so that he can participate in civic life, civil society, with all of the burdens and requirements contained therein. At 13, he had mastered the tradition of liberal arts, really had achieved what was considered at the time equivalent to a bachelor's degree, and so then he was sent to study law. After studying law, he embarked on a career in the legal profession, really as a courtier, but trying cases at times even in the highest court of justice in France. And it was during this time that he made what was probably the most important relationship, or he formed probably the most important relationship of his life, with a man named Etienne La Boétie. And although Etienne died only 5 or so years after they had met, he served as the chief discussion partner of Michel de Montaigne, and the essays which Montaigne wrote later in his life really are in many ways directed at La Boétie, because he, of course, was gone, and Montaigne had no one to discuss these things with. He did get married and ended up fathering 6 children, and he seems to have not had a very close relationship with his wife. This was an arranged marriage. Only one of his children actually lived into adulthood. All 6 of them, I believe, were daughters, and it was his second daughter, Leonore, who ended up living a full life there. That was not uncommon in the pre-modern era. After spending time in this high-pressure career, um, and achieving great success as a lawyer and a statesman in the Parlement, the Bordeaux Parlement, as it was called. He decided at about age 38, 1570, 1571, to retire. You might think, well, his career is just getting going. Well, for a nobleman, this was not uncommon. Montaigne wanted to be a thinker. He wanted to spend his life as a philosopher, spend his life writing, and he had plenty of money, given the family legacy, to do this. He had a chateau to retire to, and so he sold his position. That actually was not uncommon in those days. He had a position at court, a position as a lawyer, and he sort of put it up for the highest bidder, received a lump sum for it, a substantial amount of money for the position he held, and he retired to his chateau in southern France near Bordeaux. And in 1571, he began writing the Essays. This is his most famous work. I don't know how many essays there are in the full collection, but there are dozens, if not hundreds of these. The full edition of this reaches more than 1,000 pages. These are a remarkable set of writings. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but this may be it's considered by many the most modern of all of the works of the 16th century, the most accessible work of the entire early modern period. It's one that has excited the imagination of many thinkers and many students for centuries at this point. While he was working on these, he took a long journey. He wanted to see Rome, and so he journeyed through Germany and Switzerland and eventually ended up in Rome. He was recalled to France after about 15 months because he had been elected mayor of Bordeaux, and he spent 4 years, 2 terms actually, as mayor there before retiring. And this drew him back into court, back into the kind of highest circles of political circles of the land. So this is what involved Montaigne in the conflict that emerged with the death of King Henri III, King Henry III. He ended up supporting Henri de Navarre, as I said, who became Henry IV. But he was not well. Montaigne suffered from kidney stones and ultimately died of an illness only in his late 50s. And it's a shame that he didn't live longer. During that time, even as he was acting as mayor of Bordeaux and involved in politics again, he produced 5 editions of the essays. The 5th edition is considered the definitive and final edition. So let's talk for just a few minutes here about the essays, and specifically about the essay on cannibals that you're assigned to read. Of course, essay has, students hear the term essay and they probably start to sweat, probably start to get uncomfortable because that's something that they're asked to produce from time to time. And it's supposed to be a nice polished work with an argument and everything. Well, to some extent, Montaigne writes in that vein. That is the genre, but really the term essays comes from the French verb essayer, which means to attempt or to try. Montaigne saw these very much as attempts to wrap his mind around issues, around problems. There are times when he takes up one point and seems to argue that, and then turns around and decides that what he had been arguing was incorrect, was invalid, and decides to argue along another line. What we have to realize about these is there were 5 editions, and over time he entertained a lot of different ideas, contradicted himself. He didn't necessarily go back to correct what he had done before, or to take that earlier essay out if he decided to countermand what he had said. Often Montaigne is just left with a phrase that he coined in some ways, which translates into English as, "What do I know?" Maybe I have this right, maybe I don't. I mean, he is very much a modern thinker, or even to some extent a postmodern thinker in that regard. He's not confident all the time that he has the right answer. He thinks he does. At times, he thinks that he's on to something, but maybe he's not. The very last line of the essay on cannibals gives a sense of this kind of what do I know attitude. And so really Montaigne can be fitted into the broader philosophical school of skepticism. That is, people who are not, who don't necessarily believe there is a right answer to everything. He's maybe the greatest of all of the skeptical thinkers, according to some reckonings. The essay you're assigned to read is called On Cannibals, and the reason it's included in this course, I think, is as a follow-up reading to the work of Columbus, who sees these savage peoples he has discovered as a people to be enslaved or at least coerced to do the things that are desired by the King and Queen of Spain. These are the guarantees that he makes of them. One of the justifications that Europeans gave in this period for enslaving other peoples of Africa and peoples of the Americas, is that these people were savages, that they needed to be forced into civilization, into Christianity, that slavery was in fact a positive condition for them, that they were doing something that was merciful and good by enslaving them because it meant that they were protected from their worst tendencies. Now, there is nothing, I think, that would excite the horror of a human being more than the proposition of cannibalism. And this is one of the reasons I think that Montaigne takes up the topic of cannibalism. Because the peoples of these distant lands, these savages, were accused of eating each other, and again, there's nothing so morally reprehensible, so horrific as that. So Montaigne asks simply, should we judge cannibals just because they eat each other? Is that really the worst thing in the world? And he's skeptical of that. He says, well, maybe it's actually not so bad. And he proceeds to argue along those lines. A few quotes that I'd like you to draw reference to. I don't want to give you all the answers here necessarily, but he says here, as with anyone, we should judge them by the test of reason and not by common report. We shouldn't necessarily believe everything's being passed around about these people. We should instead use reason. There's the scholastic thinking behind all of this. He's very self-reflective here and even critical of his own kind of European mentality, Western mentality, by saying, we call barbarous anything that is contrary to our own habits. I do not believe, he says, this is bottom of page 108 in the reading, I do not believe from what I've been told about this people that there's anything barbarous or savage about them, except that we think that anything that's not like us is barbarous or savage, right? Is Montaigne on to something here? That's a question that I want you to consider and maybe talk about in the discussion boards. He very much betrays his utopian line of thinking here, similar to Thomas More, and going back, we could point out Plato and some others in the ancient world. He says that these people are actually very close to their original simplicity. That is, they are kind of a blank slate, and the concept of blank slate is something that is introduced by John Locke, and we'll talk about that later in the course. But when he says they're still governed by natural laws and very little corrupted by our own, that means that these people are waiting to be influenced. But we shouldn't influence them by enslaving them necessarily, to try to take them away from their worst and savage tendencies, because as Montaigne sees it, they don't necessarily have. There's not necessarily a problem with what they're doing here, and so they need to be guided and coaxed in a positive fashion. He says, I'm sorry that Lycurgus and Plato, Lycurgus, the legendary founder of Sparta, which had a kind of utopian system, at least it was considered to have that by many thinkers, I'm sorry that Lycurgus and Plato did not know them, for I think that what we have seen of these people with our own eyes surpasses not only the pictures with which poets have illustrated the golden age, but the ideas and the very aspirations of philosophers as well. In other words, there's a lot that can be done with these people, and what we're doing with them is a shame and a travesty, the way that we're judging them, the way we're thinking about them. And then he turns to several points of criticism. whilst judging their faults so correctly. He says, yes, it's terrible that they eat each other. That's not a good thing. But we should not be blind to our own faults, right? Is it worse to eat a man who is already dead, or to torture somebody, for instance, who is alive? Which is more barbarous, in fact? And Montaigne was probably referring to some of the things going on in the wars of religion that were being fought in the 16th century, which revealed very much the barbarism and savagery that Europeans were capable of. Those would become even more horrific in the next century with the 30 Years' War, but that's beyond our inquiry here. And so, he says, we are the ones who surpass them in every kind of barbarity. But, and this is, here's the skepticism, here's the kind of what do I know, at the very end, it's like, well, all of these things that we've talked about with these people don't seem so bad, but then they do not wear breeches, right? They don't wear the proper clothing, and so maybe we should judge them. Maybe they really are inferior because they don't dress like us. And I think there he's just sort of poking fun at the standards by which people judge each other, right? On the basis of what they wear. Very superficial things. That's what Montaigne is concerned about, or one of the things he's concerned about. Montaigne was tremendously influential. We'll see later that Shakespeare borrowed a lot of ideas from him. The Tempest, in particular, takes very much from Montaigne. In fact, he even borrows some of Montaigne's words in a couple of the speeches in that play. Other philosophers like Descartes and Pascal were heavily influenced by Montaigne. Descartes' famous maxim, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, really began with this question of skepticism that Montaigne raised, right? Is there anything that I can know? Descartes asks. And he says, the only thing I can know for certain is that I can think, right? Cogito, I think, therefore I must exist. And so Montaigne and Descartes were birds of a feather in that regard, both very skeptical of things, both not satisfied with easy answers or with the philosophical systems that have been constructed before, certainly not with any kind of uncritical or unreasonable analysis. They wanted more than that. So Montaigne, again, very good model for our thinking about how to be a liberally educated person. Good. Well, I will see you online on the discussion boards then. If you have questions, feel free to raise them on the discussion board. I look forward to talking with you.